Hi, my name is Brittany. I'm coming to you from my classroom library because I don't have a fancy bookshelf at home, and today I'm going to share with you everything that I read in May. The first book that I completed in May was actually one that I read the majority of in April, and that is Keeper of Velocities, Neverseen. This is book 4 in the series that follows Sophie, who is a girl who grew up in the human world and then finds out she is an elf. It is a middle grade book. I am kind of addicted to this series right now. I've actually been passing copies back and forth with a former student of mine from last year who has been reading the series as well, and he's one book ahead of me, so I've been giving him the next book and I'll get the one he just finished and we get to share it, and it's a lot of fun. It is definitely a middle grade series intended for middle grade students, especially in the dialogue. I find that it feels a little repetitive at times, but the overall story is really fun and intriguing. There are tons of twists and turns. There is a lot of cliffhangers. There is a little tinge of YA as the characters in the books tend to get a little older. There's a bit of a love triangle, although for Sophie it's not that because, like none of them actually engage in any of it or say it out loud. It's just these very obvious feelings. It's very cute. I would highly recommend it to any 5th, 6th, 7th graders, maybe even 4th graders that can read higher levels. That enjoy fantasy. There's also really fun kind of takes on elf lore from throughout pop culture and how it fits into their actual world. The second book I read in May was the ebook version of Mockingjay from the Hunger Games series. I have taken part in a book club this year that was rereading all of the Hunger Games books in the lead up to the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes being released this month, and I kind of fell behind a little bit. I was supposed to finish in April. I ended up finishing it May 3rd. I really enjoyed rereading the Hunger Games series this year. I hadn't read it since I was like 19-ish, maybe 20, but pretty young. A lot of my opinions and what I got out of it changed. It's still very much a YA book, but there's so many interesting concepts brought up inside of it, and especially Mockingjay, which is the one I liked the least the first time through reading them. I actually ended up really enjoying. I thought everything that I perceived as like Katniss being cold or unemotional, I realized was like they're a really good portrayal of trauma, and the choices she made make so much more sense to me now as an adult than they did to me as a young person, which I think is kind of a tribute to that book. So I really enjoyed that one this time around. I really enjoyed that one. And we rewatched the movies as we were going to, and it was a really fun experience. So if you haven't done that in a while, or you're getting ready, or you're excited to read Songbirds and Snakes, I would highly recommend that. The next book I finished was Keeper of Velocities, Lodestar, which is book 5. As I said, I've been addicted to this series. Follows Sophie. She's in this world, and I don't want to give too much away because it's really good, but her and her friends are kind of battling this secret organization that's trying to take down their world. And this book is very much a turning point in how their friends choose to fight this perceived evil, how they interact with this evil, and what it really means for them. So I did enjoy this one. I feel like I have to get to the end of the series before I can do like a full review of those though. The next book that I finished in May was the ebook version of The Selection by Kara Cass. I had completely missed the train on that one years ago when it came out. I remember seeing the book cover at the store and kind of reading the jacket and then being like, well, I don't want to read some romance on a reality TV show. Like, that's everything I dislike in the world. I didn't know about kind of the dystopian background behind it, and I was kind of just looking for like a light popcorn read, as I call it, kind of like a popcorn movie where it's not too deep, it's fun, it's a little bit of a palate cleanser to the other stuff I've been reading, had a little bit of romance. So I did enjoy it, but it is not, it's not that kind of full spectrum experience that deepens you, that exposes you to new things, challenges your thinking. It's just a fun, kind of simple YA romance. So there is the dystopian background, but they really don't, especially having read the Hunger Games series before that, they don't deal with the negative impacts very much. The girl who we see this through, named America, who we experience this world through, she is not, let's see, she's not as upset about her circumstances as some other dystopian heroines that you may have read through. So I don't not recommend it if you're looking for something kind of fluffy in that category, but not my favorite thing of all time. The next book that I completed was the audiobook version of Lost Stars by Claudia Gray. Over the last year, I've really found that I enjoy Claudia Gray's take on YA, and I have several of her series and really enjoyed them, and I have another one of her Star Wars books that might actually see. I'm feeling around behind me. Yeah, there it is. So this is the first book of hers that I read, and I was like, oh, I really enjoyed this, and it was it's called Leia, Princess of Alderaan, and it was the lead up to The Last Jedi. So her books that she's written in the Star Wars universe are actually canon in the new universe, so that's pretty cool. The one Lost Stars that I read, she wrote before that one, back in 2015, and it was it bridges the gap without dealing with any of the characters from the original trilogy and then the new modern, like, Rey and Kylo Force Awakens trilogy. It follows when we first meet them, they're 8 years old, 2 kids that live on a planet that is, very backwater, not very well known in the Empire. The Empire has just started to take over, and they're not really aware of what kind of went down in the prequel trilogy that led to the Empire taking over. Their families, even though they come from different backgrounds, one comes from the people that live up in the mountains that are very well to do. They're all about status and their riches. One of them comes from the valleys, where the people are much more tied to old traditions and nature and things like that. Both of their families are celebrating the Empire taking over because they feel like it's going to help their families gain new opportunities, and it actually does for a time, and they end up meeting each other at kind of a parade that's celebrating the coming of the Empire taking over their planet. Through this meeting, they end up becoming best friends who help each other to gain entrance to train as pilots to go to the top Imperial Academy, and then while there, they start to become separated by their beliefs, and it follows them through the entire timeline of the original trilogy. So they are involved in, one of them gets tied up in the rebellion, one of them stays with the Empire because they want to try and change it from the inside, even though they start to see the evils within and the disloyalty. Their loyalty tells them they can't leave it, and I'm not using the genders and stuff here because it'll spoil it, but if you know from the beginning which one goes which direction, but they go throughout the entire course of the rebellion, through the Battle of Endor, and then on to what ends up being the last Battle of Endor, which actually happens a year after the Battle of Endor, which is the Battle of Jakku. And they are directly tied into that battle. There are mentions of other famous Star Wars characters, but they don't directly interact with them. One character actually finds General Solo to be very annoying, and whenever he hears the name Luke Skywalker, he's like, oh. Which is kind of a funny take. You usually don't hear that. It's usually like, oh my gosh, the heroes. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I think Claudia Gray does best is putting the feeling of longing on the page, and we know, like, all good YA has longing and romance in it, and I thought she did a beautiful job there while also deepening the lore in the Star Wars universe, and how regular everyday people that didn't have magical Jedi powers or, the pedigree of a princess faced this time of rebellion and uprising in their galaxy. So I really enjoyed that one. The next books I finished was actually a physical copy, but I don't have it because I have loaned it out to a friend, and that is the new release, The One and Only Bob, which is a sequel to The One and Only Ivan. And if you are a teacher or have children, you've probably heard of or read One and Only Ivan by Catherine Applegate. I know as a teacher I've used it and read it out loud to my students. It's a really good middle grade book. The original One and Only Ivan follows the story and is told from the perspective of Ivan, who's a gorilla who in real life was kept in a mall circus for 28 years before he was eventually relocated to a zoo that gave him but that was also like an animal preserve and took better care of him. And so the first book follows that story. And in that book, you have a side character named Bob, who's this little dog who just wanders in off the highway one day, who's always taking care of himself, and he befriends Bob in the book. One and Only Bob follows Bob's story after Ivan's story has kind of concluded and he's gone off to the zoo, and Bob has found a family that has taken him in, but he's having a really hard time adjusting to life inside of family, inside of behavior and rules, when he has always been wild and when the original people in his life did not treat him very well. And so he has a very hard time trusting. And I thought it was a fantastic book. I cried a couple times while reading it. I read it all in one afternoon. I think it would be great to share back to back with students if you read One and Only Ivan. I think you could do it actually on its own without One and Only Ivan, because it kind of fills in enough of the information that you would need to understand it. Or if you know like a grade behind you does One and Only Ivan, then you could do One and Only Bob. Oh, my classroom lights just went out because I'm not moving around, so let's fix that. Okay, One and Only Bob, fantastic. Super highly recommend that for young people, or if you enjoy reading middle grade. I am a 4th grade teacher, so I do read a lot of middle grade, but I'm pretty sure that even if I wasn't a teacher, I would still read it. I just really enjoy, in really great middle grade, how the authors have to take concepts that are integral to our world and themes that we deal with throughout the entire course of our life and have them make sense for children without dumbing it down, because that's not what it is. You can relate all of those ideas to children without having to do it in a baby voice, so to speak. And I thought the author, Catherine Applegate, does a fantastic job of doing that with this book and with One and Only Ivan. So if you have a chance to check it out, please do. The next book I completed was the audiobook version of Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. I really enjoy Malcolm Gladwell books, and I enjoy his audiobooks even more. He does the reading of all of his audiobooks, and he has a pretty good voice for it. He also has a podcast called Revisionist History that I really enjoy. And he kind of took what he had been doing in his podcast over the last couple of years, and he's created an enhanced audiobook. So the audiobook, in places where he would have been doing a quote or like court documentation, things like that, he actually has either actual interviews with the people that he's quoting or actors reading the quotes. The book also has a soundtrack, like a theme song by Janelle Monáe, which is fantastic. The book itself and its content was challenging to get through. I will be honest. One of his kind of through lines through all of his books and all of his work is challenging our perceptions of what we believe to be true and the things that we think are very clear, like black and white, open and shut cases and questions. And in his other books that have had to do with, achievement and privilege and things like that, it's been pretty easy to go along and go, oh, that is some unique data that you brought to that conversation. The topics he deals with in Talking to Strangers, it's a lot harder to do that because they're very controversial subjects that bring up a lot of negative feelings for a lot of people, and they definitely did for me as I was listening to it. The book starts and ends and is constantly tied back into the case of Sandra Bland, who, if you don't know, is a woman that was arrested, and there is audio in the book of how her arrest went down, and it is infuriating and really hard to listen to, and that's just one of the subjects that's really hard. And then she was found in her jail cell a few days later in an apparent suicide, but there was a lot of controversy around that. That's just one of the extremely touchy subjects that he deals with here and kind of challenges our perception of how that went to. There's also really hard conversations about suicide and alcoholism and sexual assault. And all of it, he walks a very, very, very thin line where what he is presenting could be interpreted as victim blaming. I think he does his best to avoid that and to make sure that he's presenting data that just says that this is another layer to it. But I do question how responsible that is in our current climate and soundbite culture. I've seen a lot of people that had a problem with this book. I didn't enjoy it as much as I have his other books that are much more focused on kind of like scientific anomaly around, you know, our culture and our sociology. So I did rank it a little lower than previous books of his that I had, but the experience of the audiobook itself was really good, and I don't think that it's one that you should turn away from if you are interested in it. But if any of the things I just said to you are things that would be really hard for you to listen to for any multitude of reasons, then maybe it's not the way to go for you. The next book that I completed in May was Nightfall, which is book 6 in the Keeper of Velocities series. That is right, I read 3 of these in May. This one follows Sophie even further. Her friends and her kind of solidified their place in this team that is fighting against this evil group called the Neverseen and trying to change minds and the culture inside of their world that has kind of done things one way for a very long time, and those ways are not really conducive to how people, or elves in this case, actually are. So this one was great. I loved this one, I think, out of the 3 that I read this month the most. Sophie has to start dealing with the family that kind of she left behind when she went to live in the elf world, and that isn't something they'd really touched on too much yet, and I love the way the author Shannon Messenger brought it back in. I do wish it had kind of been dealt with a little bit more. I really enjoyed this one, and it made me so excited to read the next one. I'm very excited to get it back from that student that I've had borrowing it, and we've been swapping it back and forth. So there's only 2 books left that have been published currently, but she does have some more coming out later. And I just really enjoy these. As a huge fan of middle grade fantasy, since my own days reading Harry Potter as a youth, it gives me a little bit of that feeling while still being uniquely its own. I think the way I've tried to describe it to people that haven't read it is it's almost like if Harry Potter was told from the perspective of Hermione, but Hermione was the one that was special, even though I think she's plenty special on her own, and then it's the world of elves rather than, you know, wizards. And in this one, the one that would be thought of as Draco is much nicer. The next book I finished in May, I wasn't supposed to pick up till June because I was supposed to read it with the book club where I've been rereading all of the Hunger Games books, and that is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I'm probably going to do my own, like a separate review video on this book because I had a lot of feelings. It is something. And it's not all bad, but it's definitely not good, but not because of the writing. I'm gonna look forward to a full spoiler review in the future / rant review of this book. The next book that I finished, and the second to last one that I finished in the month of May, is My Year in the Middle by Lila Quintero Weaver. This book follows the main character Lou Oliveira, who is an Argentinian immigrant to America in 1970. Her family's actually been there for years before then, but the book takes place in 1970s Alabama, where she goes to school, and her school is in its first year of desegregation. Since she is neither white nor black, she is kind of in the middle, both literally and figuratively. Literally in that she has to sit in the middle row between those students in her classroom. Also just in between different friend groups that aren't interacting with each other. And all of this is the backdrop to a kind of coming of age story for her where she is going through things that all of us go through at that age, where you start to separate from your friends as you discover that you have different interests, and you make new friends that maybe don't get along with those old ones. And on top of all of that, it's also a fantastic story of learning to be an ally and standing up for your friends even when it is very difficult and uncomfortable to do so. I love this book. I am a math teacher exclusively now, since we departmentalized at my school, but if I get to teach reading again anytime, I would totally teach this book to a middle grade classroom. It is a really great perspective, and one that we don't get to see as much. It's a great take on historical fiction that's a little more modern, which might make it easier to relate to for your students. I know reading this weekend. I'm filming this the last weekend of May. With everything that's happening around the States and now around the world, it gave me a lot of hope in the humanity that exists, that kids can see beyond these things, and hopefully us as adults will get to see beyond them later too, and just treat each other well and treat each other as humans. If you haven't yet, please check that out. That's a strong recommend from me. My feet are asleep. The final book that I completed in the month of May was an audiobook version of Do Nothing by Celeste Headlee. The subtitle to the book, and the reason I ended up checking it out from my library, was How to Quit Overworking, Overstressing, and Underliving. And I thought when I checked it out that it was going to be a little more like self-help and how to quit being overstressed, because in this time of digital learning, e-learning, distance learning, what have you, I have been even more overworked than I usually am. And I was looking just for some sort of path out of that, because it didn't feel like there was anything that I could give up. In this case, I've started a booktube, so I've put even more on my plate. Maybe the book hasn't sunk in yet. Rather than being self-help, is much more of a examination of what culturally and sociologically has changed over the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution to promote these ideas that being overworked, being a workaholic is the way to be. There's also some elements that are of a memoir from the author's own life and how she has tried to overcome her own addiction to overworking. She refers to it as an addiction. One of my coworkers just walked by. So one of my coworkers just walked by my classroom window, because that's where I'm filming today, and scared me a lot. So I was talking about Do Nothing by Celeste Headlee. It was a really good audiobook. It was a fascinating look at how our culture promotes this really unhealthy, we must be working all the time, or somehow we're lazy or less than culture that we have in a lot of workplaces now. I know as a teacher it's something that we see promoted all the time, that there's this awful quote about a teacher is like a candle, it consumes itself to provide light to others. And it's like, yes, I love my students and I would do anything for them, but also we should have supports in place where teachers don't have to burn themselves out to be effective in their jobs. We should have workplace organized in such a way that we don't burn ourselves out of our careers to do what we need to do to accomplish our jobs. I liked it. I don't know that culturally will change anytime soon, but it was a good listen. I also DNF'd one book this month. I attempted to start reading the Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher, the first book being Stormfront. I got a few pages in and just realized it wasn't what I needed this month. I might try it a different time, but I just wasn't feeling it. This month I was very much about things that felt good and were nostalgic or comforting, and for me, like middle grade and YA is like a comfy blanket, and that just kind of helps me through my time, especially when we're in this crazy world that we're in right now. The stats for my reading this month, what am I doing with my hands? I completed 11 books. 3 of them were audiobooks, 2 of them were ebooks that I read on my Kindle, and 6 were physical copies of books that I either had purchased or was able to borrow from someone. And then 1 DNF that was also an ebook that I gave up on. That is what I read in May. I will try to leave links to all of those books down below if any of them sounded interesting to you. And I will see you soon, I guess. I haven't thought of an outro yet. Maybe I will someday.